All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. You know the drill. We get some interesting source material, and we really get into it. Today, we're looking at this meeting between former President Trump and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or as a lot of people call him, MBS.
Yeah.
Now, this meeting has generated a ton of buzz, particularly because, it comes at a time when oil prices are already super volatile.
Yeah.
And a lot of folks are on edge about what's going to happen next.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because you've got some people saying this meeting is going to send oil prices through the roof, right?
Oh, right.
And then others are predicting that we might actually see a dip.
A dip, yeah.
So it's a lot of uncertainty. And of course, everybody wants to know, what does this actually mean for me, right?
Exactly. Will I be paying more at the pump next week or what?
Right, exactly.
So let's unpack this a bit. What do we know about what was actually discussed in this meeting?
Well, from the sources we've got, it seems like the conversation went beyond, just the usual diplomatic pleasantries.
Yeah.
They reportedly dove into some pretty heavy topics, economic investments, for example.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and even some geopolitical strategies. So this wasn't just a quick handshake and a photo op,
Right. So there's potentially a lot more at play here than meets the eye.
Exactly. And that's why this is such a fascinating deep dive, because we really need to look at the bigger picture here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics. I guess, whenever we talk about oil prices, Saudi Arabia is kind of the elephant in the room, right?
Oh, for sure. They're like the king of the oil market.
The king, yeah.
I mean, they essentially lead OPEC, right? The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. And they've got so much control over how much oil is produced.
Right. I remember back in 2017 when oil prices were going up.
Oh, yeah.
And Trump was really pushing for Saudi Arabia to increase their oil production to try and stabilize things.
Right, exactly. That's a perfect example of how much power they have. I
Yeah.
mean, they can literally make or break the market.
Wow. So if Saudi Arabia decides to cut production after this meeting, we could see some serious price hikes, right?
Yeah, most likely. I mean, think about it. Less supply usually means higher demand. And when demand is high,
Prices go up.
prices go up. Exactly.
But what if they decide to ramp up production?
Well, then you've got the opposite scenario, right?
Okay.
More oil flooding the market, probably leading to lower prices.
Interesting. Okay. So we've got these two basic scenarios, but like you said earlier, it's not always that straightforward, right?
Oh, definitely not.
So what are some of the other factors that could come into play here based on, the information in our source material?
Well, one thing that really stood out to me was this mention of potential Saudi investment in U.S. infrastructure projects.
Okay. Yeah, I saw that too.
Now, if that actually happens, right, it could mean closer energy ties between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia.
Like a more direct pipeline.
Yeah, in a way, it could be.
Interesting.
And that could lead to a more stable oil supply for the U.S.,
Which could then lead to...
potentially more stable or even lower prices.
Okay, so that's one possible outcome. But then I also read that some analysts are saying this meeting could actually push Saudi Arabia towards limiting their oil output.
Right, and that's where things get really interesting because that's the opposite of what we were just talking about.
Exactly. And I mean, thinking back to Trump's presidency, he was always advocating for lower oil prices, right?
Oh, yeah, he was all about that. Remember, he kept urging OPEC to pump more oil?
Yeah, to keep those prices down.
Exactly, and now you've got some analysts who are saying that maybe Trump's influence isn't what it used to be.
So maybe
this meeting was a chance for Saudi Arabia to kind of push back a bit, and say, hey, we're going to do what we think is best for us.
Wow. Okay, so it's kind of like we're back to those two opposing scenarios again.
Yeah, in a way it is, but let's not forget that there's always more to it, right?
Oh, no, of course.
I mean, the oil market is notoriously unpredictable, and there are so many other factors that could throw a wrench in things.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, think about geopolitical events, for instance, as the conflict in Yemen.
Yeah.
That's a big one that could easily disrupt oil supplies and send prices soaring.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Or even potential sanctions. Those can have a massive impact too.
Right. So it's no matter what Trump and MBS might have discussed, there's no guarantee that things will play out exactly as planned.
Exactly. It's all a big guessing game.
So I guess the bottom line for our listeners is that no one can say for certain what's going to happen with oil prices.
Yeah, that's the honest truth. But hey, at least now you've got a better understanding of the key players, right?
Right.
And the potential moves they might make. So you can kind of stay ahead of the curve.
Absolutely. And, knowledge is power, right?
Well, always, especially when it comes to something as important as oil.
Exactly. All right. So before we wrap up, I think there's one more thing we should touch on.
Yeah.
I noticed that all of our source material really focus on the economic side of this meeting, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's another layer to consider, and that's the geopolitical implications of a closer U.S.-Saudi Arabia relationship.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a whole other can of worms, right?
Yeah, and it raises some really interesting questions like, what are the potential trade-offs, between economic benefits and ethical considerations?
No, right, exactly.
So, yeah, lots to think about for sure.
Definitely.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this deep dive for today. But thanks for joining us, and of course, thanks to our expert for breaking it all down for us.
Thanks for having me.
And to all of our listeners out there, stay curious, stay informed, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.
Sounds good.